Coming up next, I'd like to bring up Hafiz Sikder, who's going to help host our CEO and founder spotlight. Alongside him, we'll have Alan Bash, who is the CEO and president of Zeal Bio. Lea Hachigian, who's the co-founder and vice president and strategy of operations from Beat Bio. Robert LaCaze, who's a board member not only to Axiom, but to many other biotechs within the industry, as well as Michelle Werner, CEO of Alterna and CEO and partner to Flagship Pioneering.
Good morning, everyone. So what are your thoughts about what you heard from John?
Who wants to start?
It's not a shy bunch, I know.
So maybe I would just say putting a couple of different things into perspective. So I do think that a dry spell is a bit harsh. What I would actually argue is what we've seen in the last couple of years is much more of a correction to this over-optimistic sort of landscape that we were in the 2020, 2021 timeframe. And I think we've seen a correction. And it's not all that dissimilar to what we had prior to 2020. So I wouldn't actually say that it's a dry spell, but that we're really getting to much more of a normalization to where we had been historically. Now, do I think we overshot it a little bit? Maybe perhaps a bit so. And I do think that we'll see a little bit more of that sort of normalization come back up to where we were prior to 2020. But I don't necessarily believe that we'll see the 2020 and the 2021 days again. I think that was more the exception than the norm. And sometimes it's hard to remember that.
No, I actually 100% agree with those comments. And I think if you look at any sector, it goes through cyclical nature, then, it was almost at a bubble-like nature in 2020 and 2021. I think the other thing is when you have companies going IPO before you even have clinical data is very strange. And that was happening a lot, right, in those timeframes. Actually, one of the slides that you showed was a company doing Series A with actually going into phase 2. So that's a very different dynamic than 3 years ago. So I think it is becoming a little bit more normalized now. I think for the investment to come back in, we all know that the exit strategies need to be there for investors, and the IPO market needs to come back. And it's not quite back yet on the IPO standpoint, but the IPO will be more, I think, more with clinical data than it will be with going from a preclinical standpoint.
Yeah, they did that.
So I feel like what was striking about this kind of related is when you look at what's been funded the last year, Series A companies with phase 2 assets are also, and so trying to, when do VCs kind of start to track, the traditional knowledge of we're not really going to fund combinations, like we care about NCEs. When will that start to creep earlier? And, you get some of that stuff happening preclinically for Series A's, and you get the normal cadence, and you have a crossover to IPO around clinical data. We're definitely not there yet either. And so I'm hoping that that's maybe something we start to see, that, a Series A company doesn't need a phase 2 asset and $200 million raise to make it.
Just to add, what struck me about John's slides is there's opportunity, and those of you who are trying to move your career ahead, or thinking about a long-term career in this industry, there's just tremendous opportunity, and it's frankly energizing. I know it's sometimes easy to look at the glass as half empty, but that's all those slides presented the fact that there's still the need for innovation, and I think we're going to unpack a lot of that today. But you can grab it and really drive innovation. That's going to be the game changer to get more investment and more adoption of new technology.
Great. So maybe I think as Lea was talking about raising capital, right? Maybe let's jump right in. Elephant in the room, an elephant that's eating, asking for a lot of peanuts here. So, how do you face raising capital? What advice do you have, Michelle?
So I guess I'd say the first thing is raising capital is always difficult under any circumstance, pretty much in any market, right? So I think that really is like the first mindset we should all have. I would also say that, and having raised a Series B in 2023, which I think was very successful, $109 million, very proud of that, especially under the market circumstances. What I think our experience is it definitely is taking longer. You have to date many more investors than perhaps used to be the case. You have far, far, far more people in a data room at any given time because investors are doing much more diligence than perhaps they used to in those 2021 timeframe, where I wasn't raising during that time, but I definitely got the impression that investors would meet a company and just invest right away without necessarily doing a ton of diligence. And that was, what the market could bear at the time. And because of all of that risk that was taken on during those years, I definitely think what we're seeing is a bit of a perspective of investors to try to balance their portfolios a lot more. So now they're carrying a lot of risk, which, for companies that they went in on during that period of time, they need to mitigate some of that risk with some more confident or surer bets. And that could be more de-risk technologies or perhaps maybe more Me Too type technologies. And I think there are some investors that do have that phenotype. But I also think we see lots of investors who still have that phenotype of I'm staying away from all of that stuff. Where the money really is, or to be made, is going after the big next thing, and you got to get in there early, and you got to get in there really before anybody understands this technology or that technology has really proven itself. So I'd say number one is embrace this mindset of it's never going to be easy, and to know you're going to have to work hard for it. But I think it's also about selecting the right investors who will match the type of technology that perhaps the company is offering to the right type of phenotype that company, that investor is, willing to take on. And they're not all going to be the same.
You just go down.
Yeah, I mean, maybe piggybacking off of that a little bit, it's definitely always hard. I think one of the things we've had to pay more attention to in the last few years are what are the other opportunities that the investors that you are talking to looking at? We used to have the luxury of not really thinking as much about, okay, yes, crossovers, they can invest in the public market. They're coming to the private side to do something that they can't do there. It's a totally different pitch than when these people can look at valuations sub 100 million for companies with clinical stage data, or look at public companies with market caps that are low hundreds of millions where they have liquidity and they can get in and out. It's a totally different proposition when you're trying to pitch in that environment. Series A, Series B companies used to be able to talk to crossovers where that was not the case. And so I think this kind of fits with the image of these mega fund VCs where, if you're pitching someone that has billions of dollars under management and they have a longer term vision, to your point of matching kind of the vision of the investor with what the company wants to do, then maybe that's fine. But I think that was much more doable before than it has been now. And maybe some of that comes back as the public markets start to do better. But I mean, we'll see.
A lot of VCs are themselves having challenges in terms of having to use their reserves that they set aside for other companies because all their existing portfolio companies are also going back to them for the extension, the bridge, the next financing. But they want them to lead the next financing. So that's really important to understand in terms of, as you said, the other opportunities that they need to look at. Sometimes they're right in their own backyard, and it's hard for them to be able to look at a new technology. The other thing is, as Michelle mentioned, every VC comes at it a little bit differently. Some really want to just be at the ground floor, work with a scientific founder, and then start to do the company creation. Others are willing to kind of jump in the middle of the story and try to accelerate it. And so, every VC has a bit of a different philosophy on how they like to add value and add capital to an opportunity. And so that's important to just consider as well.
So I think from my perspective, it's raising capital, as it's been said, is never easy. But I think there's different companies in different segments. It's going to be either easier or harder. And we all know that, you have to have a great story. You need to know what the next pivot point is, the next data point, and be able to articulate that as part of your story flow. Those are all just, bread and butter type of things. But if you actually raise capital or Series A in the 2020, 2021 timeframe, where you had these huge valuations and you don't have a product yet in the clinic, that becomes very difficult because of the valuations of your company in order to raise, because you have to do a down round, and a lot of times your investors don't want to do that. So you get into this kind of catch-22 of, how do you proceed with the company? And so I think, companies that are now raising their Series A that had those valuations in the 2021 timeframe, maybe it's not easy, but maybe a little easier than companies that raise capital in that timeframe, but do not yet have a product in the clinic. I think having the story of an IND or a drug that's already in the clinic, you need to raise the next, as long as you have the positive signal. I think those stories become much easier than platform companies right now. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, platform companies were in vogue. Now, platform companies are out of vogue. So it's from an investment standpoint. I think it comes back to fundamentally though is having the right story, the right value proposition, and getting the right investor. But sometimes, having the investors period is important. You don't always have the luxury of being able to choose the right investor. But I think right now the investors also, it's a buying opportunity for them. So the discounts that has to be given, the financials are always more difficult now, more in favor for the investor because they have opportunities and they have a lot of dry powder. And I do agree with Alan. They are having to, some of the companies they've invested in, they're having to, bridge those companies because the market, they're not able to go out and raise money. So, but they can only bridge them so far. So I think there's a lot of dynamics taking place. And I don't think any of us can stand up here and say there's a specific, because every company is unique and every company is different. And having that story, the right investors, and knowing when to sell versus partner versus trying to raise capital, I think all of those strategic considerations have to be considered if you're a new biotech company.
Maybe just another thought, because I know that we all really talked about VCs and kind of investors in that more conventional sense. But if we sort of open up the aperture a little bit and think about capital formation, I think we really can't sort of forget, we're in a world right now where capital can come from different sources. Yes, they can come from VC, but partnership capital, right? Doing some kind of a deal between biotech and big pharma, is a core component of a capital formation strategy and should be part of that even investor story, I believe. And as well as actually capital from other sources, whether it's partnerships with government or other areas where you can get grants to really push technology or science forward, demonstrate some, preclinical POC even, or even clinical POC with some of those funds, really helps, I think, moves the needle. So think much more broadly when you're thinking about capital formation, rather than just kind of the narrow, it all is coming from VC. I don't think that world exists anymore.
Yeah, so it sounds like we have two advice. One, be crisp on your narrative, the story that you're trying to push out to the universe, and being creative about your funding needs or how you can get to the funds. Let's jump into decision-making framework. And I know we come from, sometimes, there's a joke, all the big pharma people go and become the C-suite of the smaller biotechs, right? And with us, we carry our big pharma ideas. How do we pivot into a smaller biotech universe where the decision-making framework needs to be more agile?
I can start here. This was a big adjustment for myself as coming out of big pharma into smaller companies, and it's principally because of the discussion we just had around capital. When you're at a big company, you're always doing portfolio prioritization, and you're making strategic, trade-offs. And obviously, a number of big pharma companies are now going through their own cost cutting. So yeah, in a big company, you are also watching the P&L. And you're, priding yourself and saying, oh, we're very strategic. We're making trade-offs all day long. But at a small company, it's very, very different. At a small company, you're really trading off with a given program. Should I do this experiment in 2 cell lines or 3? Because if I do that third one, I may get the hit I'm looking for. I'll save a couple of months. I'll have some more data to show my investors. but I might be striking out, and I should really do this sequentially to save money. So you're continuously balancing, and to your question about decision making, you're continuously balancing money spend versus time versus the data that you're going to get. Should I do it sequentially? Should I do it, concurrently? Should I take a big bet and go for it and see if I can, get by with this one experiment, or should I, have multiple redundancies in my program? Big pharma, you almost never have that conversation. You're always going to do a full program. If you're going to do it well, you're going to do it. But small companies, you have to make those individual macro decisions on a daily basis. Just an example.
Good example, Robert. Well, I mean, decision making is all about managing risk for the most part, and when you can speak to different functions and you ask them about risk, they all have a different perspective of what risk is, or what risk would be, and I agree with Alan. It's just in the biotech sector, as you're trying to make these trade-off decisions, you can sink the ship if you make the wrong decision. Whereas big pharma, if you make the wrong decision, you've got 15 other drugs behind it, right? And obviously exaggerating a bit there, but there's the importance of those decisions are really highlighted with the level of spending that you have versus how to extend that cash runway so you can get to the next milestone, so you can actually go out and raise money. That's not something you have to do in big pharma for the most part. Obviously, you're managing the P&L, to Alan's point, but it's just to a very different degree, and we all know that. I think the other part about decision making in the smaller biotechs, with large pharma, you normally have committee after committee after committee to try to get to a decision, oftentimes, right? Whereas in the small biotechs, you bring your management team in and you sit down and you kind of think through that, and you make the decision. And then every biotech's board is a little bit different in terms of where does the board need to be informed on the decision versus actually, we always talk about, do they need to be part of the decision-making process, or do they need to be just informed about the decision? So having a good relationship with the board and knowing those boundaries, and that's oftentimes is, somewhat laid out between the board and the management team, but sometimes it's not as clear. And, having those clear delineations of, because you want to move fast, but you also want to make sure that you have your board on board with those decisions as well.
Unintended.
Yes.
So maybe just building on that, because I think that you're exactly right, Robert. I mean, I fundamentally agree. Like when I was in pharma, probably made, I'm going to just say 100 decisions a day. Chances are not one of those 100 decisions had really any real meaningful impact at the corporate level in that day. But now in a biotech arena, I make 100 decisions a day, and every single one of them really is critical. But coming along with that decision making, I think also comes down to the people. My company right now is about 60 employees big. Every single person matters. Every single FTE and role matters. And you need to make sure that you have the best people in every single job, because you don't have the luxury of, fat in the system, right? That can absorb a little bit more than, perhaps is how it is in a pharma organization. I would also say my management team, it's myself and 7 other individuals, and those 7 other individuals are really at their A game, right? I mean, and you need that when you're in this type of setting, because you're making those critical decisions. You're moving fast, right? You don't have the governance that's going to, kind of slow things down. You need to have the right people around the table in order to be able to help make sure that, certainly me, and I feel this way, as a CEO, you've got all the information you need to say, are you going to do X or are you going to do Y, and feel confident about that. And then it's also coming back to the board. It's not just about what you take to the board or not, but also making sure that you're staffing your board in such a way that can really complement the skills and expertise of the management team and can really help challenge you when you need to be challenged, but then also work through the difficult moments because they have expertise, whether it's, from an investor perspective, when it's BD or translational science, whatever it is that you need, that you've got access to that capability that's going to help you ride out those kind of rougher or more difficult, impactful decisions. So I think you got to think about the people and all of that too.
Right on point. I was actually going to ask you about hiring talent, right? So just like funding, and I'm sure talent ecosystem is going through a hard time. What are your thoughts? We stay with Michelle, then we go down the line here.
I mean, sure. I mean, I feel really fortunate to be able to have an incredible team that I work with, as I mentioned. I think that the biggest thing that it's important to really look for, especially, we've come from big pharma types of organizations. I don't think everybody can successfully make the transition from pharma to biotech. I think lots of people can, but it's really not for everyone, right? I mean, so part of that comes down to tolerance for risk. Part of it is just also willingness to roll up your sleeves and get stuff done, and to know that, like, yes, maybe you were a management or executive level. You didn't really have to get too dirty in those jobs, but everybody gets dirty in biotech. Every single person gets dirty in biotech, and you need to have the right mindset and willingness to embrace that. So I'd say really picking those individuals who come with that type of sort of frame of reference and wanting to really get stuck in a lot of different things is critical, but then also making sure you're balancing. And maybe you don't want everybody who's coming from pharma. Maybe you also want people who have a lot of experience, who work in small, nimble, kind of roller coaster type environments, who can make sure that collectively you've got all of that on board.
I mean, I actually think in some ways it's gotten a lot easier. Like, I remember in 2017 trying to hire for a cell therapy company, and we had the bar of like, can we get one person in here who's worked on a cell therapy in Boston? And that was really hard. And we were talking to people from Seattle and Philly and trying to convince them to move. And so some of those things have gotten easier in just the number of novel modalities that people have touched, especially in Boston, where some of that stuff did not originate. Like, sure, RNAi, we got it, but cell therapy 2016, 2017 was hard. I also think now, maybe CMOs are harder, but I'm thinking about, my venture fund portfolio companies, we've had a lot more options replacing CSOs, or so it's in a good way, in that more people are attracted to some of these. Like, you have the right board. The competition is a little bit easier in that sense. You can take a pick, and there's more diversity of experience that we are able to see who are interested in some of these kind of like Series A, Series B companies. So maybe, that's the one upside, I think, of kind of the situation we're in now.
Just to add, I think even more so in biotech, you have to make sure you're hiring for resilience, as we talked about, and then also just, I say, like, hire for care, like people who care, people who are going to think about your business even after, after 5 o'clock and, in the evening, because, you're trying continuously to try to problem solve, and you want folks who are clever on making those decisions and making those trade-offs, and how to do, more with less, and how to work across the seams. And so, you're looking for those people who actually do want to think about your business critically and come to you with solutions. I mean, that's true for any business. That's true for big pharma as well, but it's just absolutely critical in my mind for a small company.
Yeah, there's not a lot to add to that. I think the mixture of biotech, pharma, and academia in a biotech is critical. You want the processes that a lot of the big pharma guys have without the burden of the committees. So, but there are certain processes, I think, that allow you to get to a decision or a conclusion that's maybe a little bit more well thought through versus kind of the Wild West, if you will. But you also need the nimbleness of someone who's been in biotech to really understand how do you navigate and move things faster and not get through and bogged down. But then sometimes you need that scientific acumen from an academia person who maybe no one, that's a great example. In 2017, there's very few people who had cell therapy experience then, but you might need that. So having that right foundation of the right people and talent around you is critical in any job or any company or any organization. But I think it becomes astronomically critical when you have so few people that you can actually hire. And I would agree with Michelle that, every single hire, and we know this already, but in biotech, every single hire is a must-win type of hire because there's no room for error, or little room for error.
That's great. Let's talk about people and then sustaining motivation, right? So it's tough, right? It's, funding, other challenges of the ecosystem. How do you keep motivation going or sustain it in the middle of all this? Start with Michelle.
So, I don't know if there's any one answer, right? And I think every company has its own culture, and it's a little bit different. I will say, first and foremost, I think for me, the way my sort of leadership style is very much grounded in authenticity. Mm-hmm. And I think bringing that authenticity and oftentimes that vulnerability is something that I think has worked, especially not just through the times where everything is going really well, but also when times might be a little bit trickier. So certainly I'd say that's one of the things that I just sort of naturally bend towards. But I guess the other thing that I would say is, I think when you look at the examples within our field, even some of the most successful biotech companies right now, let's just call out on Alnylam, for example, here, just down the road. Companies like that, like I said, it's a roller coaster ride, what we do. And I think the numbers of times that any one of our company, at any times our companies are close, to the brink of disaster, it happens. And then it's how you recover from those disastrous moments that really, I think, brings out the best in people and the best in companies. So for me, it's also a little bit about expectation setting, right? It is not always going to be perfect. We are going to be on the sort of down of that roller coaster from time to time. Where we show our mettle as a company happens when you're in that down period. But bouncing up in getting to the highs then, the further you go down, the higher you can get. And I think that's an important concept that I think being in this field is important to embrace. And so for folks to really just understand that and anticipate that, expect that it's going to happen, and to not panic is really, really important. We're going to stay calm. We're going to get through this. We've got the right people that we need to kind of figure this stuff out, and it will happen. So I'd say that for me is really, the way that at least I do it. But I don't know if there's only one way.
But how do you manage the panic, though?
Listen, for me, it's, I don't actually panic very often.
I know that.
And I think that's probably it, right? I shoulder the burden, I think, is leading by example, right? And, my leadership team also has the maturity, has seen lots of things before, have seen things work, have seen things not work, and have also seen things that are not working that you then figure out how to make them working and will work again. And I think when you have people like that who can really just help lead an organization, saying this is actually normal, right? If everything was working perfectly 100% of the time, guess what? That is totally not normal. And I would seriously question, is it really working? Is it really perfect? Because probably not. I think you're probably just not looking hard enough, right? And so to me, it's the mindset more so than anything else.
Yeah, and maybe to double down on that, the highs and lows are at, on months, years, timescales, but they're also on daily timescales. So expectation setting that, some days you wake up and you feel like, what am I even working on? All of this is totally useless. It's never going to work. And then by the end of the day, you have this amazing result. And it's just wow, this is really going to change some patient's life one day. So I think kind of acknowledging that that's something that people feel is helpful. The other thing that, I think we try to do a lot of I've even seen it done in boardrooms, is just having the patient presence even when you're early on. I still remember my first year in venture, there was a board meeting where they brought 2 patients in for this company to speak about kind of their experience on the trial. And that was just so profound. And they had just done a seminar for the company earlier at lunch. And the more you can kind of get out of the day-to-day and just kind of refocus on the bigger picture, I think that is also quite helpful.
All right. I'm glad I'm not going last in this answer, because I want Robert to lift you back up after. No, he's got. Robert's going to go last, because I'm going to, even though I was the glass half full guy before, I'm going to say something a little bit more tempered now, which is I'm going to flip around your question around motivation, because I'm thinking about it. Those of us up here who came from pharma, maybe a commercial background, and have been sitting in the CEO spot, or the C-suite. Sometimes you actually have to fight against the other urge, which is over-enthusiasm for like a single piece of data. You get that text with the line graph from this assay. You're like, what am I looking at? This is amazing. And there's you can run into the trap where the founders or the scientific leaders are so invested. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. They are so invested, and you've hired for care, and so you want people who care, but then they're almost over-interpreting. And so part of our job is to also temper that and say, this is great, keep the motivation, but then also how do you balance that with not getting too enthusiastic and also having a little bit of skepticism. So that's my, more tempered comment, but I think it's the flip side of motivation, because I think it also happens a lot in small companies. It's another dynamic that everyone needs to be aware of.
So keeping people grounded.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, Robert.
Well, my ex-BMS colleagues will know this term, and I live by this term, but it's something called the shadow of the leader. And if the leader is constantly panicking, the organization will panic. If the leader is constantly over-enthusiastic, then you run a real risk of misinterpreting data and overselling. So I think the leader of any company or any organization needs to keep somewhat of I won't say monotone, but an even temperament. When things are going great, we're doing a great job. Things are not going well. You know what? This is what we're here for, to figure out how to fix the problems. And we're problem solving. So it's not what happens to you, but how we react to it, right? We know that. Sometimes you can't fix them. If it's just, if the data, it's a science, doesn't work, it doesn't work. You just can't fix that for the most part. But we also seen companies that, have been up and down. You think the science, the whole IO, the CTLA-4 at one time thought would never work. And then it became this, multi-billion-dollar compound. So there are, or I should say anti-CTLA-4. So there are, keeping that problem-solving mentality is really important, but also keeping that, people will look up to the leader and will, the personality of that leader and how they address issues will actually flow down to the rest of the organization. And it may be not overnight, but eventually that will happen. And so the temperament of the organization is directly reflected of the leader. And it's easy as a leader to get overly excited or overly down, but there's consequences of that. And it's really important to remember that as a leader.
That's great. I always remember what you taught me is that setting up the mission, once you have the mission set, everything else kind of follows, right? So it kind of ties back in. You guys talked a lot about the board. I wasn't going to go there, but can we unpack the concept of board? It's not a black box, how to engage with the board, what to look for and what not to do. So Robert, maybe we stay there with you and come this way.
I think the board itself is, it depends on where the company is, what stage of the life is, right? Okay, so if you're a publicly traded company, your board makeup may be a little bit different than if you're a Series A company where your board consists of mostly your investors, right? So there, in how you manage that is going to be somewhat different. But I think it's always important at the board is to develop as a CEO a personal relationship with the board members and be able to even talk to them outside of the board meetings, because there's nothing at the board that you want to present that's going to surprise everybody, right? You want to be able to get that input. And that's the normal thing of working any type of dynamics within any type of organization, whether you're in big pharma or small biotech. The way that you manage those environments, I think, is very important. I do agree with Michelle's statement, though, as you continue to look at your board, the board dynamic needs to change over time. You need to bring in people that have those skill sets that can be very, very important to your company. So if you're a company that is, just got great phase 2 data and you have nobody on your board that has a commercial background, it's time to think about, okay, what's the remit of my board and how does that need to shift and change? So there's a time to begin to change the background of the people on the board over time. But when you're a Series A company, the board itself may consist of just your investors, which is a very different dynamic of managing than a publicly traded company board. So, the advice there would be, for me, it would be the same. Work the board on an individualized basis, develop that trust, develop those relationships, and make sure that there's no surprises for the board, but extract value from where they can actually provide the value. And I will say, though, that even at a Series A board, there may be conflicting interests among those board members as well. And again, it's just managing conflict, and you have to be aware of those conflicts.
But because of everything that Robert just said, I think this was one of the easier parts for me for the transition, because in a big pharma company, we're always doing stakeholder management. I mean, up, down, around, everywhere with partners, and certainly with the committee above you that needs to make the decision. So you're doing that so continuously that for me, this was pretty simple. And it was striking because as I've talked to a lot of different companies or, recruiters or funds, it's really interesting. They'll say like, yeah, that person just did not manage the board well. And I'm thinking to myself, that's easy. This is what we've been doing for 2 decades in big pharma. So for me personally, this was, it's all the skills that Robert just articulated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think recognizing I've met some CEOs where, managing the board is a huge part of the job, and sometimes it might come naturally, but to just recognize that as a CEO, and that might not be what a lot of people think necessarily going into it. But I've had, there's one board member I'm thinking of in particular who always says like CEO is 1/3 managing the board, 1/3 raising money, 1/3 hiring people. And you can disagree with that, but if that's your board member's expectation, you kind of have to grapple with that. I do also think kind of recognizing the transition from private company where your board is primarily people who are invested in your company, who you will go back to in a year asking for more money, versus kind of a public company board where people have switched over and you have more independence. I think kind of understanding also the dynamics at play for different investors who have invested at different times, and they have a fund life cycle and you're at the tail end of one, but at the beginning of the other, and kind of how that's going to work. Kind of recognizing that early on. I mean, these are pretty basic things, but I think those are all things that I've seen when they don't go well are really obviously problematic.
I mean, maybe the last thing I'll say on this topic, and I also will just say a flagship board is a little bit different from other company boards, so that's a caveat to this. But I really think that management teams, CEOs and management teams, like we really want to be behaving and collaborating with our board members as if they are in the boat with us, right? I mean, I think that when you think about them as not being in the boat, then I think things can go a little bit awry. But inspiring your board members to feel as though they're in the boat if they are not already there is a core component. And I would say, yes, I'd say a lot of the responsibility is on the CEO, but I do think the best board relationships that I've seen, and certainly how we try to do this at Alterna, is when we have relationships amongst most members of my leadership team with respective members of the board that have complementary skills. So that there isn't necessarily this divide that happens where the CEO has to be the kind of gatekeeper between this. I actually feel like much of the best, like us getting the best of the management team and us getting the best out of the board comes from, it's a team sport, right? And
I like that. It's like a buddy system.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen that before.
But you're speaking to a fundamental truth, right? The fundamental truth of trust. And that's how you build the trust. In any organization without trust, we know what happens when you don't have trust within an organization. And your point about the CEO not being the gatekeeper, it means that then there's a trust between the board and the management team where it's a fluid. And that really, to me, is the optimal board level. But I will say that most boards don't work that way yet. And because it takes a lot of effort to get to that level of trust.
And the trust between you and your management team.
Yes, that's a trust across the board. Yes.
This is amazing. I'm going to pause for a second to see questions in the room. Any questions on Zoom or LinkedIn? Go ahead. Do you want to ask a mic? I can. Yeah, I can.
Thanks. Thanks for your thoughts and insights. I'm Amir Khan, VP of our Emerging Biopharma Solutions at WCG Clinical. My question for you is, do you think that investor expectations of what it takes to launch a drug are grounded in reality? And just to contextualize some of that, I know over the course of the pandemic and as we came out, a lot of the conferences and forums that I participated in, I heard a lot about how investor expectations of what we can accomplish because of what we saw over the pandemic have significantly increased. So they're expecting a lot more with a lot less investment. And that high still continues, and you're not seeing sort of that downtrend. So to give you an example, like just, I'm working with a company that's developing a drug for schizophrenia for people with negative symptoms. And that's a tough patient population to work with. So you have to know that you may have budgeted X, but it's going to take you a certain amount more to be able to get those patients don't show up to their appointments, right? So things like that. And I just wanted to get your perspective on, are the expectations realistic or not? Thank you.
Yeah, I think John's slides spoke very well to the fact that the bar continues to raise, and also that the productivity is going to be continually challenged and under pressure because of the technologies, the new platforms, radioligand therapy, as you mentioned, cell and gene therapy. These just are more complex in terms of manufacturing, and then you might have an outage in a clinical study. And then to implement that into a launch and into a physician or a clinic's workflow, these are all challenges. The Project Optimus, where you have to really, demonstrate different dosing and that you've actually hit your maximum dose and you've shown your least tolerable dose. So I think these are all things that add complexity to a clinical study. I think we're going to talk about biomarkers later. That's going to also bring great complexity. And also the fact that there are, let's celebrate the fact that a tremendous number of new technologies and new treatments have raised the bar on responses and survival and efficacy. And so, yeah, it becomes harder. So maybe, your question is, do investors appreciate all of that? Probably not. And there is just, I think, just that challenge as we go. The bar continues to go up.
Well, you're also talking about schizophrenia too, which is a very different disease area than oncology. You're not necessarily talking about life and death on that standpoint, but that is a very difficult disease, and I think most people underestimate the impact of schizophrenia on the family, not just the patient themselves. It's devastating for families who have a patient or a family member who is not controlled on the schizophrenia. In the I don't know where the issues are in terms of what you were alluding to, but those patients are there. The treatment for those patients and staying on these drugs is really, really tough to get the compliance for these patients. So, but I would agree just with the holistic comment that you made. I don't think most people, unless you actually launch drugs, really understand the complexity and the risk and the amount of money it takes. We're not even talking about access and pricing yet, but just all the pieces that have to come together to identify the patient, make sure the patient stays on the drug, make sure the patient has access to the drug. It takes money, effort, and energy, and a well thought out launch plan in order to maximize that. So,
no, I appreciate. I mean, something there's also a lot of times in our companies, small companies, they have fixed budget ops shortly, and so you're forced to stick to that budget. When in reality, there's data points out that they'll suggest that it's going to take you a lot more money to do that. And it's that struggle between I don't have the money, but then later on you do have an unlimited response.
So I'm just going to provide a different perspective, right? So whilst I agree with a lot of what you've said, I also believe that being in a capital-constrained environment forces creativity. And I actually love, right, when you're in one of these moments where you have to work differently, think differently, do more with less, be much more creative in terms of how you solve a problem. I think that's one of the things that, maybe they don't get it. That's fine. But I also think I would say challenge yourself also to think, can I be more creative here to figure out how to capture that patient or to get this, moving in a different direction? I don't think that's easy, But I do think that there's that other lens that should be looked at too.
Great discussions. Robert, I'll start with you here. We talk about innovation, and I feel like sometimes we're stuck to our old definition of ways of innovation. If you didn't have any guardrails, this is a little bit of an abstract question. How would you define innovation? Like, when we were discussing different endpoints, we tried to figure out how different way to look at trials, et cetera. Of course, we're going to discuss trials and other resource later in the day as well. But what would you say how we define innovation as we are going through this crossroads into the future?
So you picked me to start with the toughest question, huh?
You can do this.
Yeah. So, for me, the innovation really is always rooted in the science of the drug and the technology and the benefits that you're bringing to patients. The other part of the innovation is operationally is how do you get there quicker? What do you do, differently? And, I think, some of the things that the panelists have said already is actually when you have problems that you need to solve, it actually is a mother of an innovation because you either solve them or you go out of business. So you have to be able to solve those issues. From a pure innovation standpoint, if you look across the biotech sector, there's so much going on right now in the different disease areas and the different technologies. I mean, you've seen the explosion of ADCs, you see the explosion of the radiopharmaceuticals, you've seen the ebbs and flows of the cell therapy component. And those are some, we talk about AI, for example, on the innovation. I'm not certain how much AI has happened with pure basic science on the discovery, because you need a reservoir of information to be able to pull from in order to actually implement the AI. Where on the commercial side or the clinical side, when it's a little later, you can really use that technology from an innovative standpoint. The clinical trial design, this is something, if you actually look at the data, and there was a report I just saw from, I think it was ASCO or AECR, that 70% of the U.S. population still doesn't have access to clinical trials. So how do you get access to clinical trials? I think COVID, there was a lot of innovative things that came out of that in order, shipping the drug straight to the patient's home and not being in the doc, so how much of that can you sustain or could we sustain on different ways of having access to these clinical trials versus the traditional, drive, 4 hours to the big university or clinical trial site, stay overnight and get your drugs. So there has to be, for phase one, maybe that's still necessary, but phase twos or maybe phase threes, certainly phase threes, there's probably ways of doing things differently that from a regulatory standpoint has to be on board with that as well, right? So the innovation can't be just within the company. It has to be bringing the authorities along with you in order to be able to implement some of those processes.
Alec?
Well, I'll say two things. One is on the mindset side, and then on maybe kind of where the source of innovation is. On the mindset side, I'll just mention one thing that I think, again, small companies might tend to fall into a trap of not doing well enough, and I think it's incumbent that we reinforce the idea that you have to look outside your four walls for innovation. Again, if you've been working on a particular target or you've been working on a particular program for several years, it's very easy to get heads down in it. And I think part of the job of the CEO or the leadership team is to say, this innovation or the ideas, good ideas could come from outside of our company, and go find those, and make sure you have a scientific advisory board, or you're, scanning the literature, or you're challenging yourselves with different opinions. So I think kind of looking outside, that's the mindset piece. The other thing in terms of source of innovation, we really haven't touched on it yet, maybe we'll hit on it later, is data and analytics. I mean, the amount of data that we can now use to unlock some of these scientific questions has just, obviously expanded exponentially. And everyone loves to talk about AI, but the AI is basically just reading, the models. The data has to be there, or it's all garbage. So I think that we have an opportunity to just make sure that we are vacuuming up as much data as we can, and doing it in a focused way, obviously, but making sure that we're using that for finding new insights, whether that's on the treatment, on the target, on the structure of the protein, on the customer base, on just basically anywhere that we need more information about what's going on, companies, I think, need to really invest there and make sure that they're leveraging data for innovation.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would turn it around. I feel like what we've learned that innovation is not, is something that had been kind of previously prioritized by the early stage venture ecosystem, which is kind of like finding the next coolest technology in academia that's not built to solve a problem and then kind of turning it to solve a problem. That's like the hammer and nail thing. And so cell therapy came out of that, right? It's so cool. What if we could engineer a T cell to kill cancer? And then that worked and it's amazing. But, the 11th bell and whistle you can put on that is not, maybe it's innovative, but I don't know how impactful it is. We do have when you brought up the regulatory piece, we had a company that actually had a really innovative IND strategy to look at TCRs on different HLAs under the same IND. So that type of thing that hugely moves the needle and really kind of has increased in a meaningful way the amount of patients they can recruit and trials they can launch, and then to a truly innovative approach where you're now multiplexing TCRs, right? That is like hugely impactful innovation that no one thinks of as particularly innovative in concept, but just kind of in execution is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's such a broad word that could mean anything, honestly, Hafiz.
Thanks, Michelle.
And I would say that you can innovate on many different dimensions. And one of the things that I think that we've focused a lot in the past on the what, like what we're innovating and who we're innovating for, right? I think those are the kinds of things, like the big questions that we've tackled over the last decade or so. I think we're in the sort of arena of the how we're actually doing it. I think there's the regulatory piece that comes with it. I would say even, do we have to continue this tried and true, test everything in these animal models ad nauseum before you go into human populations? Have we really learned that is a full, translation from species to species? I'm not sure, right? So I think that there are ways for us to really continue to innovate on the how. Doesn't mean we shouldn't give up on innovating on the what, because we certainly don't need another PD-L1 inhibitor, sorry. And I've worked on like 5, right? So I can say that. But I would say, thinking about more in which the how comes into play and really innovating on the how is, I think, where we're going to move the needle substantially on, both time and the efficiency and the impact that we can have with these technologies.
Amazing. Quick, rapid question. What gives you optimism?
My son. Yeah. My son who has Duchenne, who inspires me every day to keep pushing and work faster and work harder and make magic happen.
Great motivator. Lea?
And some of the slides you showed with the kind of trends and what's been approved just in the last 10 years, we've had so many amazing things happen. It's just, I hope the next 10 are that impactful too.
Yeah. We'll never be bored in this job. That's pretty much exciting.
Yeah, well, I'm getting older, so I need some of these beds, so we need to get these
Hopefully not none of the ones we're working on. This is great. We will have follow-on discussions throughout the day. Thank you for your time, panel, and we'll see you again soon.
Can't do.